game 2. Cracker ATM. Let's go e4 this time. And I'm going to disable the alerts while I play the games, if that makes sense, because when I put this on YouTube, people like it when there's like a specific kind of, people like the flow. This does not diminish my appreciation for the support, and I'll re-enable them like after each game. So he's playing the Scandi. I go d4. And basically, the queen d6 line is legitimate. That is a variation of the Scandi that rose to prominence recently. But the way that we play this isn't really substantively different from other Scandis. We just develop our pieces and control the center. There's nothing crazy that we have to do here. But, we have to be very careful because he's immediately applying pressure on the pawn. What is his next move going to be? And how should we deal with that move? What is his general scheme of development here? So he's clearly applying pressure on the pawn, which means what does he want to do? He wants to go bishop g4. And the sort of Russian school of chess move is what? Well, I'll explain d5 after the game, but I'm a little bit worried that pawn will be insupportable. Let's go h3. Not a move I love to play, but it really annoys the hell out of people. Now I can't put the bishop here. And putting the bishop... Okay, now he goes a6. But I didn't even really want to put the bishop on b5. Where should we put the bishop? Where can we put the bishop now? Now that we've dealt successfully with his main idea, we can develop actively, and that involves a move like bishop c4. And now, if we're thinking about pushing our pawn to d5 at some point, it's easier to do that. Now we're just going to castle. And where should this bishop go? And we've been through this many times. This is like the natural classic square. We just bring our pieces into the game. Yeah, black can play e5. Yeah, bishop g5 is right. Bishop e3 would be slightly more passive, although a case could be made for that as well. Now we're going to make another... Well, he wants to play rook d8. We still have to be very careful about protecting this pawn. At the same time, I'm not too worried about that. What I am slightly worried about is the move b5. I don't want to let him go b5 with tempo and then fianchetto his bishop. So how can we stop that? We're kind of playing prophylactically this game, trying to annoy him. Let's go a4. Exactly. This is a common move at like a GM level. You'll see this all the time in various positions. And if he goes rook d8, which I think he will, yes, he does, this is not a problem. What we really want to accomplish here, I've talked about this many times. The best way to defend the pawn is with another pawn. So it would be very nice if we could play c3 and fricking forget about this problem once and for all. How can we go about doing that while not blundering the pawn in the first place? Yes, we could go knight e2. This knight could remaneuver to g3, a slightly more active square. And as necessary, we could play the move c3. Okay, so queen b4 is one of those moves that looks intimidating, but I don't believe it really is. Because the reality is queen takes b2 is going to be, it's going to be unthinkable. So we can go bishop b3, but then he might go knight a5 and keep harassing us. So let's see if we can defend this bishop with something. Can we kill both problems at once? Yeah, we can just go b3. We can go b3. We don't have to even worry about queen takes b2. And if he goes knight a5, the bishop can drop to d3 and aim itself at the king. So the queen on b4 is kind of stuck in no man's land. We can take on e7. We can also drop the bishop to d2. Either move is good. Let's simplify a little bit, leaving him with a bad bishop. And now let's involve our rook and x-ray the queen, discouraging him from playing e5. And we can then bring our knight out to g3, which we're going to do, and kind of complete the x-ray. Slightly better for white here. He goes queen f6. Where can this knight go from here? What would be a nice pathway for the knight? Who can tell me? Yep, knight e4. Excellent. And white is slightly better here. Nothing extraordinary. He's playing well. Queen h6. And from here, he could go to c5. But we shouldn't necessarily rush with that, although that is very tempting, so I'm going to do it. Although he can go back to c8 here. And he's doing fine. But we're going to start piling up on him. What does it mean to pile up? We need to look at the center. We need to ask ourselves, well, are there squares that we can access in the center for our pieces? What comes to mind? What squares can we jump onto? Well, he goes b6. So, all right. So that is interesting. We could consider taking this pawn, although I don't love that. What we're going to do instead, let me think about this, is let's drop the knight back to d3. so that we can go to e5. So notice I'm doing all these maneuvers. It might seem mysterious. What I'm essentially trying to do is optimize the placement of my pieces. I'm trying to find the best central squares for my pieces. And the move b6 is something that hopefully we're going to make him pay for. He's creating these, these weaknesses on the queen side, and eventually, one day, hopefully we'll be able to exploit them. Which knight do we want to put on e5? That depends on what he does. Although I like putting the f knight so that the queen has access to the kingside squares in case we want to get started on an attack. The perk of putting the other knight on e5, which is what we're going to do here, is that the bishop can then drop back to d3, which is what we're going to do, and aim itself once again at the king. Okay? And now, look, his position is getting more passive. Ooh, and he's missed a very nice retreat for the knight. Where can we go? And what immediately do I think of when I play f6? Is this the pawn on e6? Look how weak it is. So what we need to be doing is bringing the knight back with tempo. His queen is almost trapped. Okay, oh, he goes here. And now we can just take the pawn. And once that pawn falls, his whole position is going to start collapsing. We are actually threatening something really, really cool. I'm anticipating this move. I'm anticipating bishop f6. Okay, he goes f5, and he doesn't defend against it. Look very carefully at the queen. It has no squares. Can we attack it? Yes, we can. g3 traps the queen. The rook on e6, guarding d6. The knight's defending against the other squares. He's going to have to give his queen up for 2 pieces. That's actually really cool. So you can see the pressure. Rook e4, he had d6. So that's why we put the rook on e6. Not only to take the pawn, but also to deprive the queen of that square. All right. So we put the pressure on. Okay, so knight c3, we shouldn't panic at a move like this. We should ask ourselves, oh, so he finds a defense, but the reality is he does it at a great cost to his position. Now, if we were to move the queen, he'd take the knight. So let's take his queen. And the funny thing is, we now need to find a way to win the maximum amount of material. So what should we do here? What we should do is realize that both knights are hanging. Okay, both knights are hanging. What does that mean? Both knights are hanging. That means if we were to move this knight away, then he would not be able to save both knights at once, which is what we're going to do. We're going to go knight g to e5. We're not going to take any of his knights, because then he would take ours and attack the other knight. And now we're going to win the knight. And if he goes knight d5, which he's probably going to do, we're going to pin that knight with bishop c4. Now let's simply activate our pieces, knight to g5. We're going to go for checkmate here. Even though it's an endgame, once again, look at the amount of pieces that are next to his king. This knight wants to go to e6, and then we're going to take g7. The game is basically over. Yeah, so things are getting more complicated, but we're following the same logic that we've always followed. None of my moves should be like that mysterious. So a move like bishop c4 involves some tactical vision. He's put his knight on the same diagonal as his king. So now we can do a bunch of different things. We can go rook d7. Yeah, we're going to do that. Because the reality is, if he takes on d7, then we take. Then we take on d5 and attack his rook on a8. So there's some tactics. None of them are unbelievably difficult. Here, for example, what should we do here? We should notice that the rook on a8 will be hanging if we take d5. What should we take d5 with? Yeah, we should just take. We should just take d5. And bishop takes, or rook takes would also be fine. Here we can take either rook. It really doesn't matter. I should play a little bit fast because I'm low on the clock, and he resigns. Great game. Okay. So he played the Scandi. And queen d6 has gotten quite popular lately. Even a book has been written about it. And now h3 to stop bishop g4. We're just developing our pieces. White is slightly better here. a4, stopping b5. Now knight e2, right? A lot of people would look at this move and say, it's a retreating move. I don't really want to retreat. We're at the level when you can't think that superficially. Retreating moves can be perfectly fine. And I've made that point for a very long time. So we want to play c3 ultimately to permanently secure the pawn on d4, so this knight could get relieved of its duty and come to g3. Okay, so queen b4, now b3. If we had gone bishop b3, he goes knight a5, he attacks the bishop, and if we move the bishop, we have to deal with queen takes b2. That's kind of annoying. Okay, so b3. Knight d5, we take on e7, leaving him with kind of a passive bishop. Now we go rook e1, x-raying his queen. Knight g3. Knight e4, knight c5, like just improving our pieces. And now knight back to d3. So The reason we don't take his bishop is there's no need to do that. Our knight is good, his bishop is bad. That's a simple cost-benefit analysis, and it helps him get his rooks to the d file. Thank you, JTM Waffle. There's no other good square for the knight. So again, it's technically a retreating move, but really it's not, because we want to reroute the knight to e5, which is exactly what we do. So he goes knight to e7, we go knight to e5. The reason I didn't play knight fe5, I mentioned that we might play this move, but the bishop is kind of stranded here, and I didn't want to leave it stranded. It's like b5 idea is kind of nasty. Why didn't we take a6? So that is, I wouldn't say that's a free pawn, because let's approach this in, like, what is my intuition say? What is my brain telling me? My brain is telling me, look, this knight is stranded. That should make sense to everybody. The knight has no way back. And what he can do is he can just defend the c7 pawn. And guess what? I don't want to deal with this just for a pawn. Like, who knows if I'm going to get my knight out? Maybe I am. I don't think he's going to win the knight. But this leads to complications that are not worth a pawn. Pawns are just, like, not that valuable in the grand scheme of things in the middle game. And I didn't want to engage in this, particularly in a blitz game. And by the way, as XCSME points out, yeah, bishop c8 needs to be dealt with, but we can take the knight and open up this evacuation route. Okay. Okay, so knight d5, bishop e8. Now we go bishop d3, aiming the bishop at the king. And the move f6 is the decisive mistake. How did I immediately know what to look for? Well, again, I often mention formative games in my chess career where I committed mistakes similar to what my opponent does. And there was a game that I have previously shared in the context of a funny story. But that game itself has instructive value. I've made this very similar mistake myself, okay? It's not like I'm immune to this kind of stuff. And my 2700 rated plus opponent failed to perceive this exact type of weakness, okay? So watch this. I'm going to find this game and I'm going to show you. It's my game against Dmitry Yakovenko, who is a Russian super grandmaster. And I literally made, I would say, a very, very similar, slightly more complicated version of it, but a very similar mistake. Yakovenko, 2737. I've shared this game before, 2015. So basically, as black here, I was like, I'm annoyed as hell at this knight. I'm going to chase the knight away with f6. Oki Rebel, thank you for the sub. And I failed to appreciate that, that I'm weakening the e6 pawn. Because in my mind, I was like, the bishop's defending it. But guess what? The bishop, it turns out, is overloaded. White has a very simple overloading tactic that my opponent also missed. Because it doesn't often occur at like the GM level. People don't usually blunder this kind of stuff. So what is White's move? And people are going to see this very quickly. The bishop is overloaded. It has two jobs. Both of them are very weighty. So knight takes c6. And let's say black plays rook takes c6. It doesn't matter. And eventually, you go queen takes c6. You've won a second pawn. And you win the bishop. And white is completely winning. White is 2 pawns up. Black can win one of them. But now after rook a2, everything is protected. a6 is going to collapse. Black's pieces are scattered. And black is just lost here. It's not quite resignable, but white would have won this. And my opponent, after thinking for like 5 minutes, goes knight back to d3. Well, it's not that simple, but I'm sorry, but like this is a game between a 2700 2600. Everybody should follow at least the principle here. So I've done this before. The same exact type of mistake. And I really want to emphasize that. Even though the close might be different, the sort of type of mistake is exactly the same. So be very careful about weakening those central pawns. That's, yeah, we laughed our asses off, exactly. That's the ultimate goal here. Knight g4, rook takes c6, and now detecting the queen. Queen is trapped, and we simply go g3, attacking it and trapping it. Okay, what if he did f6 before knight e7? So if he did f6 here, then there was no way to win the pawn directly, but it's okay. I mean, we could have gone like queen e2 or, I don't know, rook e4, rook h, although that's blunders a fork on c3. So we could have done something like this and centralized the queen. Yeah, he could have gone knight c3 and forced the exchange of queens, but that exchange of queens is not necessarily horrible for me. So I don't know. There's details here, but the bottom line is, this is like the arc of the game. How do we see that the queen is trapped here? Well, we've had games before. Where we trap the queen sort of in the center of the board in the middle game. And you should not exclude that possibility, even if the queen may seem safe. But I can see that the queen is surrounded by a lot of traffic. There's a lot of pieces in the vicinity of the queen. No, GM Naroditsky coaching at gmail.com. And that sort of alerts me to the possibility that the queen might be out of breath, out of air. And so G3 traps the queen. Okay. So, yeah, it just looks trapped. And rook e4 doesn't trap the queen, as some people asked, because the queen has the d6 square, although that's very close. All right. Any questions, or may we move on to perhaps the final game of the speedrun today? As I said, this is a bit of a short stream. Well, bishop f7 doesn't actually... Oh, yeah, he goes knight c3. And here, we just go knight e5. We transform the advantage into winning a knight. He found a way to get his queen saved, but he loses a piece in the endgame, and that's just a disaster. Ah, yeah, c5. Sorry, he could have gone c5 and opened this up. I missed that. Yeah, c5 or c6. I mean, it's still miserable, but you guys are right. Good job. Yeah, c5 or c6, and the queen has evacuation squares on b8 and c7. But I can go c4 and dislodge one knight from the other. Thank you, Wasted and Wounded, for the 2 months. 2205, Miguel Tal. Okay, that's a pretty intimidating name. All right, let's go with another. Let's go with a modern. And I've played the modern increasingly just to show how these hyper-modern openings are played. Thank you, Symphony. And basically, to reiterate, what we're trying to do here is we are giving white control of the center. Yes, we are. But then we're using our pieces as snipers from a distance to chip away at that center and attack it with our pieces. And then with our pawns at some point. So that doesn't mean we don't need to complete our development. We need to complete our development. And he goes bishop c4. Now, bishop c4, as we've discussed on several occasions, there is a small tactical idea here that can allow us to liquidate and sort of simplify the position and actually equalize. Could somebody remind me of what that idea is? And you should think about this whenever there's a bishop on c4, knight on c3. Those are the contours of this tactic, knight takes c4, and then d5, winning back the piece. Okay, so he goes bishop f7. That's an intermediate move people often play. But it's not actually that good because it gives us the f-file and it gives us the 2 bishops. However, our king side is slightly weakened, so that's the rationale behind it. Now, this knight, we need to be careful because this knight can go to g5 and cause us some problems. We have a weak square on e6. So before we do anything crazy, we need to take care of the passageway of this knight to g5 and e6. What move allows us to do that? Yeah. Now, you guys might look at this move and say, well, aren't you weakening your king side even further? We kind of are, but it's more important to prioritize stopping knight g5 than anything else right now. And now we can continue our development. So we can play a lot of different things. We can now play d5, actually control more of the center, and get this knight out of e4 permanently. We do weaken the e5 square, but we can control that square effectively by getting our knight out quickly, and perhaps even at some point playing the move e5 to fully liquidate that weakness. Okay, knight c5 is a really good move, because his knight can swing back to d3. We don't need to play b6 here, because that would actually help him. We can actually just continue our development with knight c6. And then we can bring our queen out to add some more beef to the protection of the e5 square. Well, this is beef. This is like filet mignon that he just gave us. And that's the thing. You know, when people are up against these unorthodox positions, they tend to make more blunders, which is why at this level, I do recommend people to look into openings like the modern. Okay, so queen d6 here falls into our plans, and it protects g6. And now, by the way, we can go b6 and get the knight out, because the knight no longer has access to the d3 square. Now we have an extra piece, but let's not relax. Let's try to play precisely. What does it mean to play precisely? We haven't completed our development. Okay, just to remind people of the importance of completing your development even when you're up a piece. Bishop f5 is a perfectly fine move. We just got to be a little bit careful about a rook, which is sort of stranded. It does have the e4 square, though, but we just got to pay a little bit of attention to it. It is defended. Now I'm looking at this knight on b3, and I'm saying we need to use our pawns to open up the queen side. How do we do that? We have a very, very thematic maneuver here. That knight on b3 is a sitting duck. It's a sitting duck because we can advance our pawn to a4. If he plays a4, he weakens his queen side. He does our bidding for us. So, and if he doesn't, we can advance the pawn to a4 at least, perhaps all the way to a3, get his knight back to a1 and induce more weaknesses. And we can even lift the rook up through a5 to b5. So we do a million things with this one move. Well, g4 would also blunder the knight, or g3 would give the knight up, but even if it didn't, we have the e4 square. Okay, now we need to be careful. We need to put on our tactical hard hats. We're on a construction zone. We have several ways to capture this knight, with the knight and the bishop. I know most people are thinking you can't take with a knight, but let's give that a try. If we take with a knight, and then he takes queen takes f4, I'm seeing that the queens have a standoff. And at knight takes e5, queen f4, what move does black have there? Knight d3 check, winning the queen. How do you see that? How do you even let your brain find that it's a mentality thing? You gotta at least consider what happens if I do it anyway. Can I spend another 10, 15 seconds on that key position? And he can take on d5, but a queen trade is perfectly suitable to us. We're up a piece. And if he doesn't trade queens, then we've won another pawn. We have preserved our dark squared bishop. Yeah, okay, he takes. Okay, now we cannot take on f2. Our bishop's hanging. Let's move the bishop. We can move it to f6. We can move to d6. It really doesn't matter. Let's move it to f6. Keep it on the long diagonal. And we still have the idea of going a4, a3. That's the point I've been trying to make at several points today, is even though queens can be traded, that doesn't mean you should forget about attacking. Okay. Well, let's think about this for a second. If we go a4, his knight can position itself on d4. That's sort of annoying. Can we prevent preemptively his knight from coming to d4 without ruining the bishop's control over the long diagonal? Yeah, c5. How about this move? And then once we play a4, the knight has to drop back. In turn, that will allow us to go a3 and shatter his entire queenside. So these prophylactic moves are really the oil that makes the machine run. We didn't have to play it. We're up a piece, but I'm trying to illustrate the general concept, right, of preemptively stopping retreating squares when you can afford it. Sometimes you can't afford to do that. Okay. If he pushes b3, then he gives up the c3 pawn, and more importantly, his entire position is ruined. So now we're gonna now we're gonna take, and we're gonna start looking for tactics. Okay, so let's gather the data here. Our bishop is hanging. Our bishop is hanging. And our bishop actually doesn't have that many good squares, but that's okay. Why is that okay? Because we have a lot of tactical concepts in this position that we can rely on. Now, rook b4 check, a lot of people are seeing, but then he's got knight b3, and amazingly, he sort of survives there, or so it seems. But actually, if we calculate a little bit further, and we give this check, his knight is now pinned. The rook is not hanging because of the pin, and there's no way for him to get to my bishop. So we can just play c4. This is essentially a trade, but it's a good trade because we preserve the attacking chances. He takes our bishop, we take his knight, and then the c-file gets open, and we can use that c-file to get to the c3 pawn, if that makes sense. I probably didn't find the best way to play. It doesn't matter. We're completely winning. We can go rook c8, forcing his rook to a passive square, and then we're going to be up a piece. We've simplified the position, and the rest is a matter of just picking up the hanging pawns, so to speak. Okay. Yeah, this isn't the best, but I illustrated a nice concept, I think, and we're still completely winning. So, okay, rook e3 is good. Now what we're going to do, we're going to go g5. We're going to isolate this weak pawn on f5. We're going to just look around the board and turn the vacuum cleaner on. I call this turning the vacuum cleaner on. We're just picking up his weak pawns. What are his weak pawns that we can get to? What are the pawns that we can, like, get to here? There are two that I'm thinking of. The first is the f5 pawn, which we just created. The second is the h pawn, and we can swing the rook around and win the h pawn. Remember that the ultimate idea in such endgames is to create a passed pawn. So from that perspective, taking this pawn is good, because then we can start pushing the h pawn. And I'm actually ignoring this deliberately, and I'm even ignoring a check on h2, because this pawn is going to go so fast. And you guys will see that. He simply doesn't have the firepower to stop it. Watch how quickly this pawn just runs to infinity. Right, exactly. So now we're just going to get our rook back and then run this pawn up the board. I don't care about anything else. All I'm going to look for is whether he threatens my rook. You got to be careful. You don't want to be too cavalier about these positions. Here, he's not going to be able to stop it. Whoa, look who's here. GM Hikaru. Thank you. 5 gifted from the man himself. Hikaru, thank you. I really appreciate it. Wow. I think he's got a thing or two to learn from the speedrun, you know. After all, I don't think he's fully grasped some of these concepts, you know, and thank you, Akara, really appreciate that. Thank you, you too, congratulations, that was well done, and I really appreciate that. Okay, so what is our goal in this position? Our goal is to get his king onto a square where we can check it with the rook. If we were to move our rook right now, anywhere, he would simply take on h2. So we need to use tactics to draw his king to a checkable square. And that square would be c3. So we notice the square on c3. We capture twice. And now we've gotten the king onto a checkable square such that we can now promote to a queen. Check. Yeah, we can fossilize him here. Check. I can take the juicer. And now the mate is very simple. We just ladder checkmate him on h3. Right. Good game. And yeah, I'm going to slow this down for the sake of, you know, certain GMs who might not understand the pace. Okay. Basically, this was a modern, which we played. And we took on e4, which is the common tactic in these positions. I've talked about this before. When you see this and you see a knight on f6, you should connect the dots and play knight takes e4 to break into his center. And the best way of dealing with this, in my opinion, how can white deal with this to preserve his bishop and not give up a pawn? Like, what is the sort of move that is often played in these positions? Well, the perk starts with d6. It's actually very often transposes into each other. Bishop d3. And now you take on e4. And now we can go after this pawn. We can go knight d7 and c5 and attack the pawn. Thank you, Justin. High kiss. And black basically liquidates white's center. Black is doing very much fine here. That is why knight e4 is good. But he decided to take on f7. Okay. And that's the reason we played h6 is to prevent his knight from accessing the g5 square. That would not have been that dangerous. So this is an example of where I, as a GM, might have played differently, right? I might have just developed my knight or developed my bishop. But I want to illustrate this concept of playing prophylactically to you guys. Right, so d5, knight g5. And what can happen here is that he gets his knight to e6, and he forces us to give up our light-squared bishop. And this leads to a host of unpleasant consequences. Does that make sense? So that's why we start with h6. We deprive the knight of the square. And only after he goes c3 do we go d5. And the knight has to go to an inferior square than g5. So knight c6 now we develop, and he blunders his bishop here. After this, everything was very obvious. He probably should have done this first. This would have made bishop f4 possible. And can somebody remind me, what did we plan to do against this move? Or against many other moves? Thank you, Spencer Lux, for the tier 1. So not g5, because that would create too many weaknesses on the king side. Right, Mr. Lama, it does. You're right. But the reality is here, well, it all hinges on us finding the next move. Knight g5 comes with tempo. It attacks the rook. It makes us lose time. That time allows him to increase his control over e6. So the move, ladies and gentlemen, is queen to d6. We are doing two things. First of all, we are bringing the e5 square under control. And second of all, we are stopping bishop f4. Why are we stopping bishop f4? Because we can take, earning us 2 pieces for a rook, which is very good for black. Okay? The logic should be pretty simple here. Queen to d6, and also we're potentially preparing e5, which would liquidate us from the weakness. So at this level, it all kind of depends on tempi and concreteness, right? The concept can be correct, but the execution can be wrong. Thank you, Spiro Man, for the tier 1. But he blunders the bishop. And now everything is very simple. We bring our pieces in. And now knight takes c5 was like the key move. Thank you, Dragon X. If queen takes f4, then knight d3 check with a discovered check and winning the queen. Well, jockeys, if you consider the material sort of, if you literally consider the math, usually bishops and knights are considered 3 points each, and a rook is considered 5 points, so it's 6 against 5. But that doesn't tell the whole story. In the middle game, 2 pieces for a rook is usually good for the 2 pieces. In the end game, there could be a confounding factor. A rook, and this is something people should remember. When you have no other pieces on the board, a rook is often very much superior to 2 pieces. Because rooks are more mobile, and they could go around vacuuming up pawns. It can be much harder for the bishop and the knight, for example, to coordinate in time to prevent the rook from, you know, running amok and taking pawns and supporting passers. So if you have an endgame, you need to be careful. If you have a middle game, 2 pieces usually better than a rook. Okay? So the really only interesting moment of this game, which I didn't fully explain, I think is here. So c5, right? We want to play a4. And the logic that you should be using, right? When you're considering a move, can I play move X? And you say, well, where can my opponent move his piece? Knight d4. Yeah, we can trade. But I'm trying to illustrate the concept here. Can we take that square away from him first? Yes, we can. c5. And then we want to play a4. How can I determine whether a trade is good for me or not? Well, I mean, look, I can't give you an algorithm. What I'm trying to do here is show you how I do these kinds of things in the game. But basically, at the bottom line, you want to weigh whether your piece is better than your opponent's piece. And I think this bishop is on the long diagonal. It can support an attack, and I don't really want to give it up unless I have to. I ended up giving up the other bishop, and it is precisely the dark squared bishop which ultimately won me the game. This bishop was responsible. Yeah, I think I'm going too fast for Hikaru. I don't think he's following this. Rook takes c3. The reason this works is because the bishop controls the c3 square. Does that make sense?